Good evening to all of you. As you all know, Mr. Balyuzi, the hand of the cause, passed away in February 1980. And from that time, the Association for Baha'i Studies dedicated a special session of presentation to his memory called Hassan Balyuzi Lectureship. And since then, we have faithfully observed this presentation, and many renowned speakers have been giving this presentation, amongst whom you recall the first presentation was made by Douglas Martin, Mr. Muhammad, and Mr. Abbas Afnan, and then other speakers that you are familiar with the names: Glenford Mitchell, Firuz Kazemzadeh, Gil Morrison, Dorothy Freeman, Adib Tahirzadeh, and others participated at this presentation. Tonight is a very special evening for this presentation. You will understand why I call it special. Mr. Balyuzi, in his introduction to E.G. Brown and the Baha'i Faith, says that he feels qualified to explore that theme because his father knew E.G. Brown and had correspondence with him, and Mr. Balyuzi had access to many original documents that made him qualified to undertake that work. Dr. Moojan Momen has closely worked with Mr. Balyuzi and assisted him in his research works. That's why I call it very special, because I think he is well qualified to make this presentation tonight. We all know Dr. Moojan Momen through his works and also through his association with the Association for Baha'i Studies. I'd like to make a very short introduction and leave the rest of the time to him. Dr. Momen was born in Iran and moved to England when he was 5 years old, and he resided there since then. He is a graduate of Cambridge. He is a medical doctor, he's a general practitioner, but he has done extensive scholarly works, that some of them are here displayed, and I am just going to mention few of them. The Baha'i and Baha'i religions, 1844-1944, that you see here displayed. He is also the editor of volumes of studies on Baha'i and Baha'i history. Another work of Dr. Momen, Introduction to Shia Islam. Also, another book that you can find it here, Selections from the Writings of E.G. Brown on the Baha'i and Baha'i Religions. A recent work of Dr. Momen, which is available again here, Baha'i Focus on Development. Dr. Momen has extensively traveled to Africa, to Asia, and Europe. And he has been several times in North America, as you all know. Tonight, in the memory of Mr. Balyuzi, he is going to talk about the learning from history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Momen to this presentation.
Alapa. There are, is that right? There are a large number of reasons why Baha'is may be interested in studying Baha'i history. They may find the stories of the early heroes of the faith inspiring, or perhaps some may find figures such as Mullah Hussein or Tahireh as role models that they would like to emulate, or Baha'is may be simply interested in finding out more about their religion, for there's, after all, no better way of finding out, understanding the present, the situation of the Baha'i faith than by studying how the present arose out of the past. But this evening, although all three of those are very appropriate and understandable reasons for undertaking a study of the history of the Baha'i faith, this evening in this lecture I want to look at one further reason for studying the Baha'i faith, and that is to see what the past can tell us about the future directions for the Baha'i faith. And in brief, the thesis of this presentation is that a close look at the patterns of the past may give us valuable guidance regarding the challenges that face us at the present time. For example, if we look attentively and thoughtfully at the actions of Abdu'l-Baha in the past, this may give us guidelines as to the most useful directions in which to turn our energies in dealing with the challenges that present themselves at present, and also whatever may present itself in the future. I can't deal with this subject in toto, so the challenges that I'm going to sort of focus down on are the challenges, and I thought this would be particularly interesting to deal with tonight because of the overall theme of the conference. The challenges that I want to deal with in particular are those created by the massive influx of poor third world villagers into the Baha'i community in the last approximately 3 decades. And to be more specific about these challenges, there seem to me to be 3 areas in which this challenge exists. The challenge of formulating the teachings of the Baha'i faith in a way, formulating these teachings for these people. Secondly, the method of presentation of these teachings. And thirdly, ways in which we can assist in realizing these teachings in the lives of these people, these basically rural third world villages. So I want to start by just doing a very brief overview of the history of the Baha'i faith but from a particular angle or perspective. The Baha'i faith has certainly spread throughout the world at a very impressive rate in its 140-year history, and confirmation of this has come out within the last few years, in that even independent authoritative sources are now citing the Baha'i faith as being the second most widely spread religion in the world, after either Christianity in general or Roman Catholicism in particular, depending on which particular source you're looking at. But this spread has not been a steady process. It's not been a sort of steady diffusion out from the middle, as it were. What it has been a process whereby you have spread and consolidation within one particular cultural world, followed by a breakthrough into a new cultural world, and then spread and consolidation in that cultural world, and then a breakthrough into another cultural world. If we start right at the beginning, the religion of the Bab was addressed primarily to, not just to Shi'i Iranians, but a particular category of Shi'i Iranians, those who had been through the process of attending one of the religious colleges, who had undertaken religious training. The writings of the Bab are written in a very difficult style, mainly in Arabic, and they contain esoteric illusions and philosophical terms which the majority of Iranians, even if they were literate, would have considerable difficulty in understanding. Only those who had studied in the Shi'i religious colleges, and in particular those who had studied under Sayyid Kazem Rashdi in the Shaykhi school at Karbala, would have understood all of the allusions and the symbolism in these writings. And so therefore it's not surprising to find that the early Babis were indeed mainly members of the religious classes, and in particular were Shaykhis who became Babis. All of the letters of the living, for example, were students of Shaykh Kazem Rashdi in Karbala. And even in the later period of the ministry of the Bab, when a wider selection of people came into the religion, the vast majority of these people came into the religion as a result of the conversion of a local religious dignitary, a local religious leader. For example, in Zanjan, where several thousand of the population became Babis, they became Babis because Mullah Muhammad Ali Hujjat Zanjani, the local religious leader, became a Babi, and they had always followed him in religious matters, so they became Babis. So even in that later period in the Bab's ministry, still primarily it was a religion that was addressed to those who had had religious training, and the other people sort of came in as a secondary consequence of that. And so the Babis were confined during most of the ministry of the Bab to a narrow grouping of Shi'i clerics, together with those that followed them in matters of religion. And of course, geographically, the religion was confined to Iran and southern Iraq. Now, the first breakout out of this very narrow cultural world really occurred as a result of Baha'u'llah's activities, and in particular during the period of his exile to Baghdad. And it was Baha'u'llah himself who was responsible, even before he declared any mission, even before he declared any position for himself. He was responsible for initiating a number of new directions for the Babi movement. Firstly, he wrote books in a plain style, easily understood by ordinary Iranians. This was a new direction for the faith. If you read the Kitab-e-Iqan, the Book of Certitude, this is a book that's easily understandable to literate Iranians, where the writings of the Bab are not. And so, therefore, he was able to make a direct appeal to literate Iranians, and we can read in histories like the history of Haji Mirza Haydar Ali, how enthusiastically this book was received by the Babis in Iran. Secondly, Baha'u'llah widened the circle of those who were in contact with the Babi faith by starting to converse with other groups of people. During the time he was in Baghdad, he opened up contacts with the Iraqi Sunni ulama. He talked, for example, to Sheikh Abdul Hamid, known as Ibn al-Alusi, who was probably one of the most prominent of the Sunni religious leaders in Baghdad at the time, and also Sheikh Abdul Salama al-Shawwaf, again another prominent Sunni figure. So again, this was widening the circle of those who were in contact with the faith. And thirdly, while both the Shaykhis and the early Babis had been somewhat antagonistic to Sufism, Baha'u'llah spent some time after his sojourn in the mountains of Sulaymaniya, actually in the town of Sulaymaniya, in among a group of Sufis, talking with them, and then later when he returned to Baghdad, he wrote books such as The Seven Valleys and The Four Valleys, specifically directed to this group of people. So again, he was widening the circle of those people that were being communicated with. And geographically, of course, during the successive stages of Baha'u'llah's exile, we see a spread of the religion into Turkey, Syria, and then with the spread of the followers of Baha'u'llah taking the faith into Egypt, into the Caucasus, into Turkestan, and into India. Now, nevertheless, the religion remained confined basically to Muslim converts until about the 1880s, when the next significant breakthrough occurred. And that was when Jews and Zoroastrians in Iran and a little later Christians in Egypt and Syria started to come into the faith. Now again, the groundwork for this had been laid in an earlier period. As early as the Baghdad period, Baha'u'llah had addressed biblical themes in books like the Kitab-e-Iqan and in the Jawahir al-Asrar. And perhaps even more directly connected with the influx of Jews, say, in Iran, was the work of Mirza Abul Fazl Golpaygani, who wrote books specifically relating the Baha'i faith to Jewish and biblical prophecies and themes, and thereby took this process further. So, as a result of this, during that period, Jews and Zoroastrians and Christians started to come into the faith, and the, if you like, the cultural borders of the faith were expanded. And this continued until the next major event really took place shortly after the passing of Baha'u'llah. Up until that time, the faith was still, although there were Christians and Jews and so on in the faith, it was still culturally the Middle East. In other words, even those Jews and Christians that had come into the faith, they were still culturally and psychologically a part of the Middle East. And the next major cultural breakthrough that occurred following the passing of Baha'u'llah, when the faith was taken to North America. And it's interesting that it was taken to North America by people who had become Baha'is from a Syrian Christian background. People like Ibrahim Khairullah and Anton Haddad were people who had become Baha'is from a Syrian Christian background, and therefore it was much easier for them to take the faith to North America and start talking about the faith to other Christians. And the crucial task for the new Baha'is, that the new people who became Baha'is in North America, was to reformulate the Baha'i faith into the context of the West culturally and into the context of Christianity religiously. And if we study the early publications of the North American Baha'i community, we can see them struggling to reformulate these teachings that had come to them from a completely alien setting, a completely alien culture, reformulate them in a way that would be suitable for their own fellow countrymen. And it was Abdu'l-Baha himself who gave a great deal of the impetus for this reformulation to those in the early stages of his ministry, to those American Baha'is who came to him in Akka. He spent his time with them talking about Christian themes. We have books like Some Answered Questions, which are the result of this interaction between Abdu'l-Baha and these early American pilgrims, and he develops the themes of the faith, relating it to Christian topics. And you have a whole section in Some Answered Questions on Christian subjects. And then, even more importantly, what you might call the cultural adaptation of the faith to the West was undertaken by Abdu'l-Baha during his journeys to the West in 1911 and 13. Between 1911 and 1913, when Abdu'l-Baha picked from the vast range of the teachings of Baha'u'llah a number of topics that were the subject of interest and concern to his audiences in the West. And so successful was he in doing this that he succeeded in attracting the attention of the press and of many of the leading intellectuals of the West at that time. And as a result of this obviously strengthened the Baha'i community in North America, and from there the Baha'i faith was taken in this, what you might call Christian Western reformulation of the faith, and was spread to Europe and to the other outposts of the Christian West, such as Canada, Hawaii, Australia, South Africa, and elsewhere. Now, I don't want to sort of give you all the details of all of the different cultural breakthroughs that occurred, because one could continue on this theme for a long time. But the next major breakthrough that occurred, really we have to come up to the 1950s and 60s, when the Baha'i faith started to spread rapidly among the villagers of the poorer nations of the world. And again, the foundations perhaps to this, were laid in the very early days of the faith, when the faith was spread into the villages of Iran. And in a sense, that this was the same process being repeated in different parts of the world. Of course, small numbers of Baha'is had gone to places like Latin America in the 1930s and to the rest of the world in the 1950s as part of the 10-year crusade, but there had been few conversions of the rural populations of those countries initially. Mainly it was the Western educated elites that were even contacted, and some of them became Baha'is. And then in the late 1950s, and more particularly in the 1960s, large numbers of villagers from the poorer nations of the world, India, Africa, South America, and the Pacific, began to become Baha'is. And this breakthrough occurred principally because of a change in the focus of the activities of the Baha'is, pioneers who went to these countries, where they switched their attention from those people who were culturally most like them, in other words, the Western educated elites of those countries, because those are the people that they've been contacting up to that time. They switched their attention from those people to the rural, illiterate masses of the country. And of course, this represents a very great breakthrough, both geographically and culturally. These third world villages have, after all, very little in common, either culturally or religiously, with either the Muslim Middle East, where the faith originated, or the Christian West, which was the next main area to be introduced to the faith. And this influx of large numbers of rural peoples from various third world cultural backgrounds has produced an enormous change in the makeup of the Baha'i world community, and I think we probably don't appreciate sufficiently how vast a change there has been. To give you some idea of the extent of this change, I've calculated some very approximate statistics that prior to 1954, approximately 94% of the Baha'i world population consisted of Iranians. Before 1954, 94% Iranians. Today, 30 years later, and a few years later, the number of Iranians is approximately 7%. So we've gone from 94 to 7%. And conversely, the number of non-Muslim third world peoples has gone up to 90%. That's the enormous shift around that there has been in the Baha'i world in the space of 30 years. And of course, the Baha'i world is still, to a large extent, grappling with the consequences of this vast shift. We've sort of had landed on our doorstep, as it were, large numbers of poor, illiterate villagers with whom the Baha'is of the West or of the Middle East have very little in common culturally. And yet somehow these people's knowledge of the Baha'i teachings have to be deepened, and they have to be incorporated into the life of the Baha'i world community. So that's the survey that I wanted to do, but now I want to see what lessons this survey has for this task of trying to bring this process, of trying to carry out this process. And in particular, I wanted to focus on what Abdu'l-Baha did when he came to the West in 1911 and 1913, because I think the lessons are to be drawn from there. What Abdu'l-Baha did was to, from the vast range of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, in coming to the West, he chose a number of topics that were of current interest to his audiences. We have now enshrined these topics that Abdu'l-Baha chose, and in our current formulations of the Baha'i faith, we call them the 12 principles of the Baha'i faith. And these 12 principles are regularly presented in talks and pamphlets as though they were in some way a definitive or complete presentation of the Baha'i faith. And yet if we examine carefully the circumstances of the original presentation by Baha'u'llah, we find that he made no claim that this list of teachings was an exhaustive list. He doesn't even say that these are the most important teachings of Baha'u'llah. When he's introducing these teachings, the commonest expression that he uses is just something like, among the teachings of Baha'u'llah is, and then he'll go on to talk about one of these teachings. And when he gives an entire listing of these teachings. He says, these are a few of the principles proclaimed by Baha'u'llah. So as I say, he doesn't claim that this is a complete list. He doesn't even claim that these are the most important teachings of Baha'u'llah. What he has done is to take from the range of the teachings of Baha'u'llah those which would be of most interest to the audiences in North America and Europe that he was addressing, and therefore he chose the topical issues of the day which were of concern to the sort of people that he was addressing. Issues such as women's rights, for example. This was a period that saw a peak in the activities of the suffragette movement and so on. Or harmony of religion and science. That period of time with the controversies over Darwin's theory were still being very hotly debated in Europe and North America. And significantly, we don't find Abdu'l-Baha, for example, addressing these issues in this way when in his correspondence with the Baha'is of the East. Even more significantly, there are other major social teachings of Baha'u'llah that were not presented by Abdu'l-Baha during these journeys. In the Loh-e-Dunya, the Tablet of the World, Baha'u'llah states, special regard must be paid to agriculture. Although it hath been mentioned in 5th place, unquestionably it precedeth the others. Now here we have a social teaching that Abdu'l-Baha more or less ignored during this period of his travels. And interestingly, as I say, this special attention to agriculture is one of 5 teachings that is in this Tablet of the World. And Baha'u'llah says, although it's been mentioned in 5th place, unquestionably it precedes the others. And what others are there in that list? Well, we find, for example, an international language, promotion of education for all. Even we find in that list the promotion of the lesser peace by the Universal House of Justice. Now, these teachings are the ones that Baha'u'llah says should take 2nd place to the importance of agriculture. But Abdu'l-Baha judged quite correctly, of course, that this particular teaching of Baha'u'llah would be of little interest to the predominantly urban audiences that he was addressing in the West. And therefore, if you read through his talks in the West, you'll find he makes passing mention of agriculture, but he doesn't give it any prominence in the majority of his talks. And he never lists it in his lists of teachings that he gave from time to time during his travels in the West. And so I would submit that what Baha'is have done is to forget or ignore the spirit or the principle of what Abdu'l-Baha did, and they've clung to the form of it. The spirit of what Abdu'l-Baha did was to choose those aspects of the teachings of Baha'u'llah that were of relevance and of concern to his intended audience. We've ignored that and we've clung to the form of it, which was that particular list of 12 or whatever number it is, teachings that he actually chose. And much of what we have constructed in the West and we now call the Baha'i faith has arisen from this and other similar exercises in formulating the Baha'i teachings. I'm not saying that these are irrelevant now. What I'm saying is that they're obviously still of interest and of relevance to those for whom they were originally intended, which was city dwellers in the West. And it's perhaps not even surprising that we've clung on to this particular formulation of the Baha'i faith, because after all, the Baha'is who are in the high positions in the Baha'i administrations and who are the writers and presenters of the Baha'i faith since the time of Abdu'l-Baha have mainly been city dwellers, either from the West or from the Western educated elite of Iran. And such people are comfortable with this presentation of the Baha'i faith because it is a presentation that was originally intended for people such as them. And so they've repeated and amplified it to the point that it is almost universally thought that this is what the Baha'i faith is, whereas in fact it is only a Western conceptualization of the Baha'i faith. And of course, urban Baha'is of the West now, as I have said, constitute a very small minority of the Baha'i world. And yet we continue to present the Baha'i faith in this way. So, to summarize, what we have done is to construct a version of the Baha'i faith which is oriented towards Western urban populations, and we're now trying to use this formulation as a basis for presenting the Baha'i faith to the other 95% of the world who don't fit that category. Of course, it would be highly desirable if I could at this stage of my paper now pull out of a hat for you an alternative formulation of the Baha'i faith that would be suitable for use in the third world. But unfortunately, I am just as bound and limited by my background and upbringing as everyone else in this audience is. Ultimately, it must be the people of the third world themselves, of the rural third world themselves, who will derive a full formulation of the Baha'i teachings for themselves. All I can do is to present some avenues that would be worth exploring. The first avenue that would certainly be worth exploring is what I've already indicated, to rethink the presentation, for example, giving the importance to agriculture that Baha'u'llah gave it. If rural areas, for example, in other places in the Baha'i writings we find that if the idea that rural areas should be given the same degree of priority as urban areas are now given. If amenities and services were extended to the rural areas to the same extent that they now exist in towns, and if agricultural work was given the same status and respect that it deserves as the fundamental basis of the community, which is what Abdu'l-Baha calls it, then this would go a great way towards alleviating some of the problems that beset the third world countries, problems such as the flight of the population from the rural areas into the urban slums. And again, in another place, Abdu'l-Baha has set out a system for solving some of the economic problems of agricultural villages. He talks about setting up a community storehouse, into which contributions are paid in accordance with certain principles that he gives, and this store then cushions the community as a whole if there's a crisis in the community, if there's a period of drought, or if individual members of the community fall into debt, or to provide for the needy of the village. And in this way, the village becomes, to a larger extent, self-sufficient, independent, on a basis of cooperation. And then from that sort of initial, I'm now going beyond what Abdu'l-Baha says, but we can imagine that from that initial cooperation in setting up such a storehouse, one could go on to think in terms of cooperation in areas such as sales, marketing, community loan schemes, all sorts of other things present possibilities once you have the initial background of trust created by such a community storehouse. And clearly such teachings as these would be far greater interest to rural populations than other Baha'i teachings such as international language or international system of weights and measures or whatever else it is that we currently spin out as being our presentations of the Baha'i faith. Now, another aspect of the way in which we can make our presentation of the Baha'i teachings more concordant with the cultures with which we are in contact is to look at the different ways that some societies look at religion itself. Already we've seen that in spreading from an Islamic Middle Eastern setting to a Christian Western setting, the Baha'i faith adapted its presentation. In the West, the life of the Bab, for example, was seized upon for its parallels with the life of Christ, and this comparison became an important part of Baha'i presentations of the faith in the West. But Christianity and Islam are very much closer to each other, are religions that are very close to each other in many ways, and they share many of the same concepts. To take the Baha'i faith to the much more radically different religious cultures of the East will require a correspondingly greater radical rethinking of our presentation. At present, our presentation of the Baha'i faith is still based mainly on Western concepts of what a religion should be. A religion should have. We still base our presentations on concepts of God that are derived from the Western religions, concepts of prophets and messengers of God, revelation of a holy book, establishment of a sacred law, prophecies. All of these things are very much tied in with a Western conceptualization of what a religion should be. And they all revolve around Western, Judeo-Christian, Muslim concepts. But the religions of the East, to a large extent, don't have these concepts. Buddhism, for example, doesn't have the same concept of a God, at least in the same way that the Judeo-Christian Islamic religions have, and therefore there's no concept of a prophet from God. And instead of trying to formulate the Baha'i faith in such a way as to take account of Buddhist attitudes and Buddhist ways of seeing things, Baha'is have tended to insist on reformulating Buddhism in a manner conformable to what we currently think the Baha'i faith is. And so we have tended to try and find a Western-type God in Buddhism, and thereby to recast Buddhism as a Western religion complete with its prophet and its holy book and its prophecies and so on. And when challenged with the fact that this is not how Buddhists see their own religion, the usual response of Baha'is has been, well, the original teachings of Buddha have been lost. Not surprisingly, Buddhists are not very convinced by such an exercise. However politely they may listen, most of them are not likely to be sympathetic to an attitude that in effect says that the whole basis of their religious beliefs are false, and that the civilization which they have constructed over 2,500 years and the writings of their most respected saints and scholars have all been basically erroneous. And in summary then, taking Buddhism as an example, the point is that Buddhism and Buddhist culture enshrines a certain worldview which predetermines how Buddhists see the world. If the Baha'i faith is presented to Buddhists in a manner that's incongruous with that worldview, then it's unlikely to receive a sympathetic hearing. And if Baha'is insist on trying to change the Buddhist worldview to make it conform to a Western vision of what it should be, then again we're equally unlikely to be successful. Only a presentation of the Baha'i faith that is fully congruent with a Buddhist worldview is likely to succeed in any major way. And obviously the same could be said about other cultures and other societies and other religions. What I think must be realized is that at the heart of religion is man's relationship with an ultimate reality, and I've avoided here using the term God so as to include Buddhism in what I'm going to say. We'll talk about ultimate reality. Since this relationship has no similarity with any other relationship that we experience in our lives, it is beyond the ability of words to adequately describe this relationship between man and ultimate reality. Therefore, every culture has evolved a set of metaphors and symbols to express this. But in the process of bringing that relationship down from the level of experience to the level of words, inevitably the innate biases of a particular cultural viewpoint will come into being because of what we were learning this morning about how language, in the process of bringing it down from the level of experience to the level of words, we start to introduce all of these preconditionings from our own culture. And therefore, as a result, this same relationship may be expressed in quite different, even seemingly contradictory ways. For example, ultimate reality may appear positive, personal, and active according to one viewpoint, which is the viewpoint of God in the Western religions, but an empty void according to another viewpoint, which is the concept of shunyata in Buddhism. But these contradictions only arise when these two terms from two different cultures are placed side by side and then interpreted as though they were occurring within the same culture, i.e. from only one viewpoint. If an empty void is seen from a Western viewpoint as a description of God, it ultimately appears faulty and wrong, a pointless, fruitless dead end. If God is an empty void, what can this possibly lead to in terms of religious expression? But seen within the context of Buddhism, ultimate reality viewed as an empty void is a rich and fruitful concept, leading to a wide diversity of religious expression. Since each set of metaphors and symbols is specific to that culture, an outsider cannot appreciate the full significance of a given term or expression. I suppose the real problem is that each individual person is only capable of adopting one cultural viewpoint at a time. Even those who've expended a great deal of effort in getting inside a culture that's different to their own, even such persons, all they can say in the end is what appears right from one cultural viewpoint appears wrong from another. There is no absolute standard by which to judge man's relationship with ultimate reality. And so when we try to present the Baha'i faith, we must be sensitive to the different viewpoints on questions such as the nature of ultimate reality, and not try to impose one particular viewpoint. Now, there may be some in the audience who may be feeling somewhat uneasy about what I've said thus far. Are Baha'is not being dishonest? Are they not dissimulating their religion if they dress it up differently to suit each different culture that they meet? I would maintain that this is not the case. To think this way presupposes that there is some essential Baha'i faith that is the real thing, and that then this is being disguised in various ways to suit different cultural worlds. But in fact, one of the central teachings of the Baha'i faith is the idea that religious truth is relative. There is no real Baha'i faith that can be identified by a set of propositions or statements. There are only individual understandings of the religion relative to the viewpoint of various individuals. There is no correct understanding of the Baha'i faith, only different individual understandings. And thus, for example, Shoghi Effendi writes, the fundamental principle enunciated by Baha'u'llah is that religious truth is relative, not absolute. And so what we're trying to do in this exercise of reinterpreting the Baha'i faith for different cultures is to see what the reality of the Baha'i faith is relative to that culture. That reality, that interpretation is just as valid as any Western interpretation of the faith that has predominated for so long. So what I've tried to do there is to give a few avenues that we might utilize in thinking about this question of how to reformulate the teachings of the faith in a way in accordance with the various cultures that we might meet. Now to proceed to methods of presentation of the teachings of the Baha'i faith to the peoples of the Third World. Again, we find that unspoken and unrecognized assumptions are being made by Baha'is based on Western patterns of thought. For example, much of the teaching work is a direct appeal to individuals. The assumption behind this is that individuals are able to change their lives and the society around them. Now that may seem a fairly innocuous assumption to make, but in fact it's an assumption that's based on a Western Protestant type of individualism that is the cultural background of many of the Western pioneers. The assumption that genuine religion is a matter of personal convictions arrived at individually, and the converse, that all other religious phenomena are second-rate and suspect, is so inherent in our ways of thinking that we are scarcely aware that it is a culturally defined approach to religion, confined almost exclusively to North America and Northern Europe. And what's more, it's a very recent thing. It didn't even used to exist in North America and Europe until with the last 500 years or so. It is not the way that the majority of mankind thinks, and it's not the way in particular that traditional societies think. Traditional societies function as a whole, and that whole includes the religious activities of the community. And individuals, in fact, have very little freedom to regulate their own lives or to alter the society around them. I've written a little bit about this in an article that appeared in Dialogue magazine about 6 months ago or so. If people want to explore that any further, then I would refer to them to that. I'm not going to go on any further about that at the moment. But in these societies, it's the community as a whole that decides the path that is to be followed, and so therefore it is the leaders of the community, the decision makers, who must be addressed. And if they accept the new message, the Baha'i faith, or if they accept a new idea that we're trying to present to them, for example, a development project that is being suggested, then the rest of the community follows. This pattern should not surprise Baha'is. Once again, we can turn to the past for clues as to the way forward. If we look to the history of the faith, we find that this is the way that the faith was spread initially. In Iran, which is after all basically a third world community, the greatest spread of the new religion occurred when whole villages or sections of towns came into the faith following the lead of their local religious leader. In Nairis and Zanjan, for example, as well as in many smaller villages, it was the conversion of a local dignitary, a local religious dignitary, that was the reason that a large number of others came into the religion, often with very little knowledge about it. This is the way that traditional societies work, and for Baha'is to try to approach these societies in other ways leads ultimately to frustration and disappointment. Another factor we may examine in teaching is the fact that our presentations of the faith are very often done in the form of talks and lectures. This again is a result of Western cultural tradition. We are used to having religious information imparted to us by lectures, either when we attend a church and we hear a sermon, or we go to a mosque and we hear the khutbah. But whatever it is, that is the pattern of presentation of religious information in the West. But in other cultures, the medium of religious communication may be chanting, songs, stories, dances, drama, pictures, statues, all sorts of other media of communication. And if Baha'is are not communicating with these other cultures in these particular media that are particular to those cultures, then there is not a full empathy and rapport in the exchange. And so we have this additional challenge of trying to develop ways of expressing our message in a medium that best communicates itself to the culture that we are addressing. So that was the second area that I wanted to explore. First of all, the formulation of the faith. Secondly, the ways of presentation of the faith. And finally, what I want to do is to look at the way forward for these large numbers of in the third world. What is the best way to proceed with these village communities? How can the Baha'i teachings be inculcated among village people so that they begin to demonstrate them in their lives individually and as a whole? And again, we find preconceptions from the West are hampering our progress in this field. Just because the way of deepening in the West is through studying the writings and attending lectures, this does not mean that it's a suitable method for illiterate rural peoples. And again, a review of history provides the clue for the way ahead. And again, Iran is the example that I will choose, because again, this was basically a third world community that came into the faith in 140 odd years ago. And if we look to the history of the faith in Iran, where large numbers of people became Babis and Baha'is in the early period of the faith, we find that for many years this resulted in almost no change in their way of life. The majority of the Iranian Baha'is knew very little about the teachings of the faith in those early days, and life continued in its traditional patterns and its traditional paths. But as time went by, there was a slow change in life for these communities. As far as I can see, the main catalyst for this change was Abdu'l-Baha's encouraging them to undergo what in these days would be called social and economic development. Abdu'l-Baha encouraged, for example, a number of American Baha'is, principally women, to settle among the Baha'is of Iran and engage in a number of projects to improve education and health. This had an enormous effect on the Baha'i community of Iran. Apart from the obvious effect of confirming the supranational character of the faith, it gave Baha'i women of Iran some idea of what they could achieve as they sought to improve their position in society. And partly as a result of the efforts of these Americans, and partly as a result of the endeavors of Iranian Baha'is themselves, this community, which had until that time been scarcely any different from the rest of Islamic Iran, began to put into practice such Baha'i teachings as the importance of education, elevating the role of women, and began to emerge as a progressive and vital force in Iran. And so what I'm really saying is that the establishment of social and economic development projects should not be considered as a side issue in the future of the faith. It's in itself the source of the future progress of the faith. It is only in those villages where the majority of the people are Baha'is that there can be said to exist the potential for Baha'i communities in the fullest sense of that word. We give the name Baha'i community to all sorts of communities in the West that really aren't communities at all. They're just groups of individuals who happen to meet for, if they're lucky, an hour a week. If they're not, perhaps an hour a month. Those aren't really communities. It's only where you've got places, villages, where the majority of the population are Baha'is that you can really say that there's a Baha'i community. And that the potential there for the development of a Baha'i civilization, if we draw the correct lesson from history, will only be realized through the implementation of social and economic development projects. It is through these that the reality of the faith can be demonstrated to village peoples and can gradually come to life in the lives of these people. And Baha'i concepts such as the administrative order and consultation and so on will only really be appreciated once they're being put to obvious beneficial use in the community through the implementation of social and economic development projects. Thus, these projects become the catalyst for the development of the community. And so through this process, it'll be through this process that the seeds of a future Baha'i civilization can be considered to be sprouting at the moment. In the same way as it was these social and economic development projects that provided the catalyst for the Iranian Baha'i community to shake itself out from its traditional paths and start to put the Baha'i teachings into effect in its life. So, in conclusion then, what a thorough study of the history of the Baha'i faith teaches us about the ways of tackling the challenges that present the Baha'i faith at present can be summarized thus. Each stage of the development of the Baha'i faith has necessitated a reinterpretation of the religion so as to present it to a new cultural world. And we need to continue the process as we take the religion to areas that are culturally very different. We've already succeeded to a large extent in taking it into certain areas of the world, but there are still areas of the world where we still haven't really penetrated, as it were, China, Eastern Europe, and so on. Secondly, we need to think about the method that we use to present the Baha'i teachings and ensure that this is the best way of communicating with the people of the culture with which we are in contact. And thirdly, we need to consider the ways in which to deepen the understanding of those who have become Baha'is. In all three areas, we are confined by a natural tendency to think of the Baha'i faith only in terms of our particular culture, our own particular culture. And in particular, we tend to think of the Baha'i faith in terms of Western, Judeo-Christian, Muslim context in which it arose and had its early spread. But if we continue to maintain such a narrow vision of the faith, we are seriously limiting its potential and hampering our efforts to spread it. And what I've tried to do in this presentation is to give some indications of some of the ways of breaking out of this narrow view of the Baha'i faith. And I would hope that others will take up the challenge and explore these avenues more fully. Thank you.